These are the journalisms by way of critical aggregation, illuminated from the analytical research of a historiographer, neither from the Oriental nor the Occidental. Your engagement, through a like, a share, subscribe, will accelerate us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before.
Engage impulse engines. Engage. Engage.
Engage.
Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage.
Engage.
Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage.
Captain.
Engage emergency override.
Engage. Engage. Engage.
Engage forward shields, 35%.
Engage.
Engage the cloaking device.
Engage.
Of them. Engage them in conversation.
Engage. Engage.
George Washington University Anti-Palestinianism unabated? This is all access. UN rights chief worries over Israel-Palestine violence. This is MirageNews.com. UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Volker Turk on Thursday expressed concern at the escalating cycle of violence in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory after 11 Palestinians were killed and at least 100 injured with live ammunition in an Israeli operation in Nablus, followed by Palestinian rocket attacks on Israel and Israeli airstrikes on Gaza. I am deeply concerned that scores of Palestinians, including a boy, 3 older men, were killed and hundreds injured in the Israeli operation in Nablus, and by airstrikes and rockets between Israel and Palestine armed groups in the Gaza Strip, said Turk. I reiterate my recent call to halt the logic of escalation that's been building up to the detriment of the human rights of both Palestinians and Israelis. The High Commissioner also expressed concern at the Israeli security forces' use of explosive weapons during the operation in Nablus. Conducting an operation involving shoulder-launched explosive projectiles and other weapons, typically associated with hostilities in a highly populated area in broad daylight at a time of heightened public activity, suggests concerning disregard for the lives and security of bystanders. Turk said, all law enforcement security operations must be conducted in full compliance with international human rights law, including by ensuring that all killings and serious injuries are investigated in accordance with international norms and standards, he said. This material from the originating organization may be of point in time, nature, edited for clarity, style, etc. And from the Arab League, from English Wafa.ps, the Arab League discusses Israeli aggression on Palestinian people. The Arab League launched this evening an urgent extraordinary session in Cairo at the level of permanent delegates to discuss Arab and international action to confront the brutal Israeli aggression against the Palestinian people, including the recent Israeli massacre in Nablus, in which 11 Palestinians were killed and more than 110 others were wounded. Chaired by Libya, the sessions being attended by Assistant Secretary General of the Arab League, Hassam Zaki, and Assistant Secretary General for Palestine and the Occupied Arab Territories, Saeed Abu Ali, and delegates and representatives of the member states of the Arab League. The sessions being held at the request of President Mahmoud Abbas to discuss providing international protection for the Palestinian people in view of the escalating Israeli aggression, which culminated in the heinous massacre yesterday in Nablus. The delegation of the State of Palestine at the meeting is headed by its permanent representative to the Arab League, Diabalu. And from the Palestine Chronicle, Arab countries slam horrific crimes following Israel's massacre in Nablus. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Qatar, and Jordan have condemned Israel's deadly raid in the occupied Palestine territories when 11 Palestinians, including a minor and an elderly man, were killed by Israeli forces in Nablus on Wednesday. Saudi Arabia, a serious violation of international law. Saudi Arabia called the massacre a serious violation of international law and urged the international community to do more to stop the violence. Earlier, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu congratulated the Saudis for their founding day on February 22nd, sparking concerns that the two countries could develop an informal relationship. Egypt expresses deep concern regarding the dangerous and continued escalation witnessed by the occupied Palestinian lands recently, according to the foreign minister. The ministry warned that the massacre could complicate the situation in the region and undermines efforts to achieve peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Qatar condemns explosive situation. Qatar's Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a strongly worded statement condemning the Israeli massacre and warned of an explosive situation in the Palestinian territories as a result of the Israeli escalation. Doha urged the international community to hold Israel accountable for its horrific crimes in the Palestinian territories. Jordan slams horrific crimes. Jordan also slammed the massacre, saying it's consistently condemned Israeli incursions into occupied Palestinian cities, including today's raid in Nablus. 11 Palestinians, including a 16-year-old, were killed by Israeli forces, and hundreds of others were wounded by Israeli gunfire and tear gas in what was the deadliest Israeli raid in the occupied West Bank in nearly 20 years. Israel launched nearly daily raids in the occupied West Bank since March 22, 2022, killing at least 61 Palestinians since the beginning of 2023. Netanyahu's far-right Israeli group, which came to power in November 2022, has intensified the persecution of the Palestinians while vowing to expand settlements in the West Bank. It includes extreme right ministers who've made incendiary racist statements against Palestinians before. From Al-Mayadeen, resistance shell state settlements following massacre. IOF strike Gaza. IOF is Israeli occupied force. In response to the recent Israeli aggression in Nablus, Palestinian resistance factions in Gaza target settlements adjacent to the Strip with several missiles. At dawn today, this is yesterday, the Palestinian resistance responded to the occupation's raid on Gaza with several missiles targeting settlements in the Gaza Strip amid overflights by occupation warplanes. Al-Mayadeen's correspondent in Gaza reported sirens heard in the settlements of the Gaza envelope. Simultaneously, a spokesperson for the Israeli occupation army said that warning signs were activated in Ascalon, Sderot, and the Gaza envelope after 6 rockets were launched from the Gaza Strip. Israeli warplanes launched at dawn today multiple missiles at a Palestinian resistance site in al-Shati refugee camp west of Gaza City, as well as another in al-Bureij city, central Gaza Strip. According to local media, the warplanes bombed the Badr site northwest of Gaza City with a missile using a helicopter. Eyewitnesses reported that around 2 hours before the Israeli raids or massacre, 8 rockets were fired from the Gaza Strip toward the occupied territories bordering the Strip. A source in the Islamic Jihad movement told AFP that its members fired a barrage of rockets at the settlements around the Gaza Strip in response to the Nablus massacre in the northern West Bank, which Palestinians were martyred by Israeli occupation forces. 11 Palestinians, including a young boy, were martyred and more than 100 others were wounded by live fire in confrontations that erupted between Palestinian resistance fighters and Israeli occupation forces after the latter stormed the northern occupied West Bank city of Nablus on Wednesday morning. I think it's important to say that this is done on purpose. This is done on purpose. How is it that 100 people are shot by live fire? These people were targeted in a very negative manner. I'm not. I see the reason why it's done this way. For the brutality, for the widespread brutality to be witnessed by so many people is a powerful deterrence. So a martyr in Jenin. Simultaneously, the Palestinian Health Ministry confirmed on Thursday morning the death of a young man who was shot and seriously injured by Israeli soldiers in Jenin in the northern West Bank 2 weeks ago. The Health Ministry identified the young man as Mohammed Nabil Fauzi Abu Sabah, 29, and added that the soldiers shot him in the abdomen. Amid the West Bank's volatile situation, armed resistance fighters in Tulkarm Governorate in the northern Western Bank, or the northern West Bank, announced the formation of Rapid Response Unit Tulkarm Battalion Group on Wednesday night. A group of masked gunmen confirmed their march down the path of martyrdom and announced that they'd shot at occupation soldiers stationed at the Al-Taybeh checkpoint near Tulkarm before midnight last night. This is the first time that resistance fighters appear in Tulkarm Governorate in front of cameras to announce the formation of an armed battalion since the end of the Second Intifada in 2005. This came as the Israeli occupation continues its aggression in the occupied West Bank, particularly in the city of Jenin and Nablus.
يا مجد الأمة وعزها يا إخواننا في جنين ونابلس وفي الضفة عامة نعزيكم ونعزي أنفسنا بشهدائنا الذين التقوا اليوم في جبل النار كما ونعزي أنفسنا فإن مصابنا ومصابكم واحد وإن دماءنا ودماءكم واحدة ولا فرق بيننا وبينكم إلا أنكم قد سبقتونا إلى درب المجد والعز وإنا والله بكم لملتحقون يا أيها الشعب العظيم الذي تعجب الصبر لصبركم واستنكر العدو لشدة باسكم يا من كنتم ولا زلتم وقود الثورة يا من بذلتم الغالي والنفيس لأجل دينكم ولأجل أقصانا وإن أملنا فيكم كبير وثقتنا فيكم عالية أن تلتفوا من حولنا فإما نكون كالبنيان المرصوص وإما لا نكون بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قاتلوهم يعذبهم الله بأيديكم ويخزيهم وينصركم عليهم ويشفي صدور قوم مؤمنين صدق الله العظيم لقد ظهرنا اليوم إلى العلن لنزف إليكم خبر تأسيس مجموعة الرد السلفي. الله أكبر الله أكبر يا بالغافر وحكير بالكربات على النافير ولنخبر المحتل الواهن.
And from Yeni Safak, Palestine called Wednesday for emergency meetings of the UN Secretary Council and the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC, to provide international protection to Palestinians following the latest attack by Israel. In a statement, Palestinian Authority Foreign Minister Riyad al-Maliki demanded that the UN Secretary Council convene an emergency meeting after Israeli forces raided the city of Nablus in the occupied West Bank, in which 11 Palestinians were killed and more than 100 injured. We demanded that Israel be condemned for the massacres committed against the Palestinians, the latest one in Nablus, and to provide international protection for the Palestinians, al-Maliki said in the statement. He also said that Palestine called for emergency meetings of the Arab League and the OIC, and demanded that the member states of these organizations condemn Israel and support Palestine's demand for internal protection. UN decries settlement activity occupied Palestine or Palestinian territory. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres decried settlement activity in the occupied Palestine territory and called for more support for Palestinians. He also took a stance against provocations actions at Jerusalem holy sites and escalating violence in the West Bank at a pro-Palestinian event at the United Nations headquarters in New York. The situation in the occupied Palestine territory is at its most combustible in years, Guterres warned. The situation in Al-Quds is becoming more fragile amidst provocations and acts of violence in and around the holy sites. It radiates instability across the region and beyond. This came during a periodic meeting of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, held as violence surged between Israel and the Palestinians. Tensions have spiraled in the West Bank after the past year of a series of deadly clashes between the two sides in 2022. Israeli raids against Palestinians have led to hundreds of arrests and dozens of deaths, mostly members of Palestinian groups. 10 Palestinians were killed on Wednesday in Nablus, which Guterres called deeply concerning. And from Al-Mayadeen, after Nablus Massacre, Lions Den says fighters welcome to join group. The Palestinian Ministry of Health announces that the number of martyrs in the Israeli massacre in Nablus has risen to 11. The Palestinian Ministry of Health announced on Wednesday that the number of martyrs have risen to 11, and the ministry said earlier that 102 citizens were injured during the IOF raid, some of whom are in critical condition, and were transferred to Rafidia Government Hospital in Nablus. A mass funeral was held in Nablus for 10 of the martyrs, amid public outrage calling for revenge for those killed by the Israeli occupation forces. Palestinian resistance group the Lions Den, Arin al-Usud, said in response to the Israeli massacre, "Will respond with a blow to the occupation, and everyone should know that the statements of denunciation and condemnation will not fend off the enemy." The group also announced that the door to partake in resistance operations along the forces of the Lions Den group is open, noting that engaging in battles of honor requires nothing but determination and sincere intention. During the IOF storming of the city, the Lions Den called on the Palestinian people and its resistance to take to the streets and confront the occupation forces in support of the brothers in Nablus. For his part, the Secretary General of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad movement, Ziad al-Nakhala, affirmed that what happened today in Nablus is a major crime committed by the occupation against the Palestinian people, stressing that it's the duty of the resistance forces to respond to this crime without hesitation. Heavy confrontations erupted between Palestinian resistance fighters and Israeli occupation forces on Wednesday morning after the latter stormed Nablus. The occupation brought in large military reinforcements from the Hawara military checkpoint. Palestinians circulated footage of occupation vehicles storming the Eastern Market, while many residents were still there. Following the massacre, the military spokesperson for Al-Qassam Brigades, Abu Obeida, said the resistance in Gaza is watching the Israeli occupation's escalating crimes against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, warning that its patience is running out. Israeli offensives continue in the northern West Bank for several months now, under the pretext of pursuing wanted individuals, with most raids being concentrated on Nablus, Jenin, Beit Laim, and Ramallah, and Al-Khalil. And also from Al-Mayadeen, Lions Den urges organized involvement in resistance with any means. The Lions Den resistance group confirmed that the resistance has extended its presence throughout the West Bank and stressed that whoever thinks the Lions Den is over is delusional, because the resistance now possesses a shield and a sword. The group further said in a statement on Thursday that whoever bets on ending the Lions Den groups is delusional and weak and doesn't know anything about the soldiers involved in the resistance group. The Lions Den called on the masses to go out tonight onto the main streets and squares in every city, village, and camp, so that the whole world could hear the sounds of Palestinians glorifying Allah and preparing in these hours for the battle of a striking response. The statement further added, "We invite you to engage immediately in resistance work, whatever the capabilities, but with good planning." The Lions Den also called on the people of the city of Nablus, its camps, and villages to participate in collective prayer on Friday morning. The Lions Den continued, "We can say to our people now, after Tulkarem joined the armed resistance and the completion of the formation of its cells, that the resistance in the West Bank now has a shield and a sword." Moreover, the statement warned the occupation that'll spend a long time attempting to study, research, and analyze the phenomenon of the lion's den in order to understand. But despite all that, the occupation will fail and we will prevail. The resistance group concluded, we'll not deviate our compass no matter the cost, and warned the occupation, saying, we're coming from where you do not expect us. Has more details on the Nablus Massacre again. And the group also announced that the door to partake in resistance operations along the forces of the Lion's Den's group is open. We got that. And for his part, Secretary General of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Ziad al-Naqala, affirmed that what happened in Nablus is a major crime committed by the occupation against Palestinian people, stressing that it's the duty of the resistance forces to respond without hesitation. And heavy confrontations erupted between Palestinian resistance fighters and Israeli occupation forces on Wednesday morning after the latter stormed. The occupation brought in large military reinforcements from the Hawara military checkpoint, and Palestinians circulated footage of occupation vehicles storming the Eastern Market while many residents were still there. Following the massacre, the military spokesman for Al-Qassam brigades, Abu Obeida, said, the resistance in Gaza is watching the Israeli occupation's escalating crimes against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, warning that its patience is running out. And here's the weekly Palestine.
Palestinian prisoners rise up in unison. Political abductions across the West Bank. The Zionist occupation demolishes another home of a murdered resistance fighter. George Washington University is called out for anti-Palestinian racism. Palestinians across Jerusalem push back against escalating Zionist belligerence. The European Parliament mixes pro-Palestinian MEPs with neo-Nazis on Holocaust Day. The Zionist colonial regime carries out another mass. It's an escalating program of struggle leading up to the 22nd of March, the first day of Ramadan, at which point they will begin a collective hunger strike. This call to action by the prisoners' movement is in response to repeated attacks by the occupation regime aimed to take away everything that has been won by the prisoners through decades of struggle, including the ability to prepare their own food in bakeries, to having more than 4 minutes to shower. The daily attacks inside the prison, combined with the escalating political assaults outside, such as the Zionist Knesset passing a law designed to strip citizenship from Palestinians in 1948 occupied Palestine if they receive financial support from Palestinian entities. The Higher National Emergency Committee of the Prisoners' Movement has called for a day of anger tomorrow, Friday the 24th of February, in support of prisoners and the struggles of Palestinians in Jerusalem, fighting back against the ongoing Zionist attacks, confiscation of their property, and demolitions of their homes. In a statement, the committee said, "Our battle has begun and will not stop except with our freedom. The jailer wanted to fight us for our most basic rights, and we will respond to him by demanding our complete freedom." On Thursday the 16th, the Zionist entity demolished the home of slain Palestinian resistance fighter Mohammed al-Jabari, who was involved in an operation at the Zionist settlement of Kiryat Arba in the southern West Bank on October 29th of last year. According to Jabari's family, a Zionist court had issued the decision to demolish their home a few days earlier, but they were notified of the date just hours before the order was carried out. Zionist forces stormed Hebron early on Thursday, restricted access to the home, and forced dozens of other families to evacuate their homes for hours until the detonation was completed. The Zionist entity routinely demolishes the homes of Palestinians who carry out resistance attacks, in a practice broadly condemned by rights groups as collective punishment. Students at George Washington University say the school has discriminated against Palestinians by canceling access to a virtual space that was registered for the purpose of providing mental health services to Palestinians suffering from trauma as a result of the Zionist occupation. A civil rights lawsuit has been filed by Palestine Legal with the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights on behalf of several students addressing the ongoing hostile environment of anti-Palestinian racism that exists on campus. The filed complaint alleges that by canceling a virtual processing space for Palestinian students, George Washington University denied Palestinian students mental health services. One such student, according to Palestine Legal, had been shot by an Israeli soldier while studying remotely from her home in the occupied West Bank. Palestine Legal's complaint invokes Title V of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which forbids federally funded institutions from discriminating against minorities. Title V has been often used to attack Palestinian and Jewish groups on U.S. campuses who attempt to block Zionist speakers from visiting their universities in an attempt to link anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism, such as occurred at the University of California, Berkeley in November of 2022. As such, the complaint also demands that the university be required to accept that anti-Zionism is anti-racist, and also that the university refuse to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism, which is opposed widely by Palestinian, Jewish, and international organizations all over the world. On Sunday the 19th, Palestinians in occupied East Jerusalem declared a general strike in protest of the growing crackdowns by the Zionist entity in the city and the array of measures imposed by the National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. This past week, at least 7 buildings were demolished in Jerusalem, 100 people arrested, and dozens of roadblocks and checkpoints were set up where the confiscation of money and assets from former and current political prisoners took place. Inside of prisons, Ben-Gvir imposed harsh conditions against the prisoners, such as closing prisoner-run food canteens, cutting off hot water, and removing kettle and gas stoves used to heat food. The civil disobedience is aimed at confronting the collective punishment that Palestinians in Jerusalem and across occupied Palestine are subject to. It includes striking from Israeli workplaces and also refusing to pay taxes to the Zionist-run municipality and other state agencies. Protests have also been held by young Palestinians at the entrances to neighborhoods such as Shafat, Anata, Jabal al-Mukabbar, Isawiya, and Al-Ram. On Tuesday, a report from the Spanish newspaper El Diario revealed that the European Parliament's Information Security and Analysis Unit drew up a list of left-wing and right-wing MEPs ahead of Holocaust Remembrance Day with the visit of Israeli President Isaac Herzog. The list contained names of the MEPs and remarks for each one on the political positions they expressed. On this list were both neo-Nazi deniers of the Jewish genocide as well as anti-Zionist MEPs who have expressed solidarity with the Palestinian cause. For example, MEP Manu Pineda of the United Left has said he has, quote, strong anti-Israel positions rather than anti-Semitic ones. During a debate in Strasbourg on December 13th, he also called Israel a, quote, criminal regime that detains and murders Palestinian children every day and pursues a systematic policy of ethnic cleansing and apartheid. He also pointed out that the European Parliament had failed to impose reciprocal measures on Israel regarding bans of entry into the EU. Finally, he called Israel a colonial regime. This happens in the same week in which the Delegation for Relations with Palestine was to make its official visit. Manu Pineda, as president of this delegation, was banned from entering since the announcement of the visit. However, MEP Ana Miranda of the Galician BNG formation was deported on February 21st after having received a favorable authorization. Miranda was detained for 6 hours at the Tel Aviv airport before being deported. Lastly, yesterday, February 22nd, 11 Palestinians, including a child and 3 elders, were murdered and more than 100 were wounded during a military raid by the Zionist colonial forces and the occupied West Bank city of Nablus. First-hand witnesses and video footage show over 60 Israeli military vehicles storming Nablus at around 10 a.m. local time, just after an undercover unit was spotted in the historic old city. The raid lasted for 4 hours and was mainly focused on a building in the city that was purportedly housing Palestinian resistance fighters. The Zionist forces besieged the house and also fired missiles at the building, also stationing snipers in the surrounding areas. Palestinian media reported that 2 resistance fighters, 24-year-old Hussam Bassam Aslam and 23-year-old Muhammad Omar Abu Bakr, were inside the house and refused to surrender. A voice recording of Hussam was shared on social media after the raid started, in which he can be heard saying, "We're in trouble, but we won't surrender ourselves. We won't hand over our weapons. I'll die as a martyr. Keep carrying weapons after us." A moment of silence for the martyrs.
And that's Al Palestina. This is Fault Lines with Robert Inlakesh.
1320. Your engagement helps make the show what it is. Don't be shy. However, we're going to be full for the rest of the show. But I want to bring in our guest. We have Robert Inlakesh. I'm going to nail it this time around. Robert is a journalist, writer, and political analyst who has lived and reported from the occupied Palestinian Western Bank. He has written for publications such as Met Press, Mondoweiss, Memo, and various other outlets. He specializes in the Middle East, and particularly Palestine and Israel. Robert, welcome to the show again. How you doing today?
Thanks for having me back. I'm doing fine.
No, thank you for joining us. So, at least, I'll just read it. At least 11 Palestinians were killed during an Israeli military raid in the occupied West Bank on Wednesday, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry, which added that Israeli forces wounded more than 100 others in what they call fighting. That is astonishing. They were basically looking for either 2 or 3 people, and they end up killing a 16-year-old boy, 72-year-old man, and of course, injuring 100 people. Give us a rundown on this. This seems radically appalling. The idea that you're looking for 1 or 2 and you end up injuring 100. They basically surrounded an apartment block. But give us your take on what is going on here in Nablus.
Well, they're trying to crack down on the armed group called the Lion's Den, and basically they're collectively punishing the entire city because it's well known that everyone supports the Lion's Den armed group and what they're doing. And of course, they've been doing this regularly, not just in Nablus, but also in Jenin, in Ariha, or Jericho in English, where they killed 5 people just a few weeks ago. Back in January, they murdered 10 people in Jenin refugee camp in a very brutal way. And it's a tactic of punishing civilians in the area as well as those who are actually the combatants. So the majority of the people that they killed when they entered Nablus yesterday were civilians. They were not combatants. It wasn't reported this way in Western media, which just simply glossed over the fact that war crimes were committed and were filmed as well. There's CCTV video footage which shows openly that the Israeli forces were shooting randomly at Palestinians on the street, unarmed Palestinians, that they were shooting into marketplaces, that they obviously shot as well. Demonstrators were there, but just average people who were standing around and not doing anything, they shot and killed them. They then blocked ambulances from going into the area. They used an Apache helicopter, which was reported in the area. There was footage of helicopters that were used in the operation. They used special forces units to go into a number of buildings in the old city. They used anti-tank missiles. They used these mini suicide drones that they've been using. And basically after they cornered 2 fighters into a building, which they were reportedly after, and they were going after, they didn't enter the building, but instead decided to bring the building down to crush them underneath the rubble. The 2 other fighters who were killed were participating in the fight to try and expel the Israeli forces from the city. And so the Israelis are basically punishing the Palestinian civilian population collectively. It's openly in a form of collective punishment. And what's most astonishing about this is that the Palestinian Authority, which is reportedly the order of Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the PA, stop security coordination. This clearly is not the case because they are coordinating with the Israelis. They are withdrawing from their own areas where they have jurisdiction to operate as a security force, but they are withdrawing. Not only that, on Monday, the PA withdrew a UN Security Council resolution, which they had proposed for it to be voted on the condition that the United States had secured Israel concessions from Israel, such as not committing these sort of violent raids and also not expanding settlements. What did Israel do just 2 days later? They went in and committed their most violent raid this year, and of course as well approved more settlement expansion.
Wow. I mean, so far this year, at least 55 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. This is according to the Associated Press. That puts 2023 on path to surpass 150 people killed in 2022.
I have a count of 61.
This is astonishing.
And they say that it was apparently what brought the building down was a shoulder-launched missile.
Wow.
They used shoulder-launched missiles to locate 2 people?
Look, I've seen reporting where they have gone through randomly shooting people, where it was, and so I'm not necessarily shocked.
Reading from the BBC here, Palestinian videos posted on social media also show young men in the street who appear unarmed, apparently being fired at while running away, with one falling to the ground as gunshots are heard.
I remember one of the cases, they were like, look, if you see anybody out there, shoot them because nobody should be there, which is astonishing. They're in neighborhoods. I mean, but from your standpoint, I mean, what are going to be the repercussions of this? I mean, clearly there's going to be a response.
Well, the response has come in the form of mass demonstrations throughout East Jerusalem and in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip. There's been demonstrations along the separation fence. That's continuing. And in the Gaza Strip, the armed groups launched 6 rockets last night. They did no damage, of course, as more of a symbolic response to link the Gaza Strip struggle to the struggle in the West Bank. On the death statistic, the death toll statistic so far this year, it's actually 64 Palestinians that have been killed this year so far. And yesterday, it wasn't just the 11 that were killed in the Nablus.
I stand corrected, 64.
Raid. A person, an individual who was a member of the armed group in Jenin, one of the armed groups in Jenin, also died of their wounds yesterday, in addition to someone from Gaza as well that also died of their wounds. So there was actually 13 deaths yesterday in total. And interestingly enough, if you read the BBC's report, their initial report on what happened yesterday, they framed this as clashes, Nablus clashes, they pegged it as. And at the bottom of their article, which they wrote on this, they said that at least 50 Palestinians have been killed this year. So they messed up the statistic. And then they put afterwards and clarified both militants and civilians. Then they said, and 11 Israelis have been killed in attacks by Palestinians, but didn't specify that the Israelis were settlers and some of them were armed combatants and even soldiers. They didn't specify that. So it shows the sort of reporting which happens when Palestinians are massacred like this. You'll remember perhaps the Jerusalem attack, which they called a synagogue shooting. It was not a synagogue shooting because it didn't take place on the premises of the synagogue, number one. Number two, it was inside an illegal settlement. And after that, they showed the videos and they published widely, the Western media, that Palestinians in Jenin celebrated the shooting in the East Jerusalem illegal settlement against the illegal settlers. They published this and they said, oh, look, they're celebrating. When yesterday the Israelis celebrated and were handed out sweets and candy in the street and dancing around about it, the Israeli settlers, what happened yesterday, that was not publicized anywhere. And it was pegged as a part of the conflict. So Palestinians can't be civilians, according to Western media, and they just die in raids and clashes, even when it's elderly people and teenagers and children. But when Israeli settlers who are illegally occupying land, guarded by a standing army, are killed, this is something the whole world needs to mourn, and they need to have rolling coverage for at least 4 hours on it.
Wow.
Hey, Robert. What impact has several months ago we were talking about the Lion's Den group, which of course is one of the new militant groups that emerged over the past year. Has there been any type of like developments with that group itself, like that, or their activity? Because I believe 2 of the people who were killed, Isleen and the other person, I know they were members of the Lion's Den, but is there any like activity building around them?
There's a lot of public support. The problem is that the Palestinian Authority operating in Nablus itself bans, for instance, people printing anything with their logo on it. It is actively attempting to hunt them down in terms of arresting them. It has arrested a number of members of the Lion's Den and is feeding intelligence to the Israelis, despite the fact that so-called they've canceled their security coordination. That's at least what they announced publicly. They've been arresting their operatives. But the group is actually growing in numbers, actually. The amount of armed members of this group continue to grow. The public support is massive. It has overwhelming support from the majority of the Palestinians. All polling data suggests that 80 to 90% of people support, actively support what they're doing. They support them to continue, and they think what they're doing is a good development. So in terms of that, then we have their operations. Now, because they are a relatively small armed group and they're limited in terms of where they can operate, they normally shoot towards either illegal Israeli settlements, but most often towards checkpoints. And a lot of these attacks are more symbolic than anything else, because these are obviously highly guarded areas. They do this in order to sort of let the Israelis know that they're there. And if they enter Nablus, they will attack them as well. Actually, last week, an interesting development happened with the Lion's Den, where the Israeli forces surrounded a building and were attempting to go into the building, and they hit it with a number of anti-tank munitions. And an Israeli special forces team actually raided the building, but it had been booby-trapped, and it killed a number of Israeli soldiers, which Israel never formally admitted to, but there is a lot of cases of reports on the ground, people seeing them, and we have the ambulances there, which were transporting their bodies afterwards. So the Israelis actually lost a few of their soldiers in a special forces unit when attempting to kill 2 other members of the Lion's Den, and this was last week.
Well, I'm curious, what do you think is going to be the outcome of this? I mean, there have been missile strikes. Apparently, Israel launched missile strikes, quote-unquote militants in Gaza, and what he called retaliation for the rocket strike. Is this just going to escalate at this point?
It is likely to escalate. When exactly this goes to a war situation where they launch a full-scale attack on Gaza, it is just a matter of when, but we don't know exactly. I would say Israel knows that this is going to happen and that Gaza is going to initiate a round of fighting because of coming incursions that will happen during Ramadan and restrictions surrounding Al-Aqsa Mosque. There will be a lot of provocations then. And perhaps the Israelis want to launch something before that to, take the initiative themselves to hit Gaza, because if they allow things to develop and Hamas to respond and the other armed groups in Gaza to respond to what's going on in Jerusalem, then they may at that point as well have mass support from what we call 1948 Palestinians or Palestinian citizens of Israel, because the issue of Jerusalem seems to unite the Palestinians of the West Bank, Jerusalem, Gaza, and also the 1948 Palestinians, as they're referred to. And so I don't think Israel wants the Palestinian citizens of Israel to participate whatsoever in strike action, because they can severely, impact the Israeli economy. And of course, riots as well is another thing that may happen. So there is a chance that Israel may launch some sort of offensive against the Gaza Strip. At this point as well, another development which is very worrying is the fact that the United States, the U.S. Biden administration, has proposed to the Palestinian Authority, which has supposedly accepted this according to a report from Axios, to form a Palestinian hit squad, like a death squad, a Palestinian death squad trained by the U.S., which would basically go into Jenin and Nablus to kill the Palestinian resistance fighters, so using Palestinians to kill each other. I think this would be a dramatic failure for one, and it won't work, but it will cause a bloodbath if this does in fact go ahead.
Oh, that's disgusting. That puts me in mind of the kill squads we were creating in South America. Robert, thank you for this, man. It's a harrowing account of what.
Remember, your engagement through a like, share, and subscribe will propel us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before. Palestine files federal civil rights complaint against George Washington University. On February 14th, Palestine Legal filed a federal civil rights complaint with the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, demanding an immediate investigation into the years-long hostile environment of anti-Palestinian racism that continues unabated at George Washington University. Below is a media roundup on the Title IV complaint in outlets including Jewish Currents, the Electronic Intifada, Middle East Eye, the GW Hatchet, and Inside Higher Ed. Civil rights complaint details on anti-Palestinian climate at GW. 3 students have accused George Washington University of perpetuating a climate of anti-Palestinian racism on campus, according to federal civil rights complaint obtained by Jewish Currents. The complaint, filed today with the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights by Palestine Legal, a group that defends the civil rights of Palestine solidarity activities, or activists, documents the experiences of the students who say that GW school officials denied them campus services for processing trauma related to Israel's violence against Palestinians, and investigated them on charges of property damage for putting up Palestine solidarity posters near campus. The administration fostered a climate of anti-Palestinianism where political expression is suppressed and Palestinians are regularly discriminated against, said Razika Sainath, a senior staff attorney at Palestine Legal. Sainath argued that her organization's complaints are a more appropriate use of civil rights law than those made by Israel advocates. Our Title IV complaint challenges actual discrimination based on national origin, not speech critical of a state built on and sustained by violations of international law. The Electronic Intifada. A federal complaint takes on anti-Palestinian racism at U.S. College. There's a severe and pervasive atmosphere of anti-Palestinian racism at George Washington University that's been happening for years, Radhika Sainath, senior attorney at Palestine Legal, told the Electronic Intifada. It's not about any one incident. We've been involved in representing people going back to 2015. This federal complaint is a long time coming, she said. Palestine's legal complaint to the Department of Education also highlights how the university's decision to officially close the Student Trauma Services Center has affected students seeking care. The center was shut after Israel lobby groups complained that Palestinian students were accessing mental health care following Israel's 2021 attacks on Gaza. By canceling the processing space, GW denied a Palestinian student who'd been shot by an Israeli soldier while studying remotely from her home in the West Bank the chance to access much-needed mental health services. Palestine Legal wrote in the complaint. A George Washington University student who did not wish to be named due to fear of retaliation told the Electronic Intifada that the situation on campus has been tense and demoralizing for those who advocate for the rights of Palestinians. With Palestine Legal's complaint, the student said that it's important to make a point that not only are these attacks on Shi'i and against Palestinians morally wrong, but they also violate federal civil rights and academic free speech laws, and they normalize anti-Palestinian discourse. If the complaint leads to an investigation of the college's lengthy history of anti-Palestinian racism and discrimination, it could allow our grievances to be legitimately heard and acknowledged, and for something to be done about it, said the unnamed student. Middle East Eye. Students use or accuse U.S. University of anti-Palestinian climate. There's simply no justification for GW's racist, bigoted treatment of Palestinians, Palestine Legal senior staff attorney Razika Sainath said in a statement. Even if pro-Israel groups don't like it and complain, the law is clear. Palestinian students are entitled to the same education and services as other students. Palestine Legal's complaint calls on the Department of Education to require the university to ensure that Palestinian students have equal access to campus services and indiscriminatory investigations of Palestinians. Federal civil rights complaint outlines pattern of alleged racism against Palestinian students. Palestine Legals representing 3 students who allege they were the target of anti-Palestinian discrimination, according to the release. Radhika Sainath, the senior staff attorney for Palestine Legal, declined to release a copy of the complaint, saying Palestine Legal wanted to protect the students from backlash and retaliation from pro-Israel groups. So deep is the anti-Palestinian prejudice that GW even prohibited the provision of mental health services to Palestinian students like our client who had suffered trauma. Sinai said in an email, even if providing such services to Palestinian students and supporting Palestinian human rights sparks complaints from anti-Palestinian groups, the law does not allow GW to discriminate on the basis of national origin or ethnicity without regards to campus services. Inside higher ed, GW already accused of anti-Semitism called anti-Palestinian. The Palestine Legal News release says anti-Palestinian students took over Shi'i's class the following Monday, making numerous anti-Palestinian statements, including that Palestinian civilians killed by the Israeli army are terrorists. The release said that the complaint also explains how GW canceled a virtual processing space for Palestinian students after Hillel, a pro-Israel campus organization, complained. Razika Sinai, senior staff attorney for Palestine Legal, said the space was offered after 2021 Israeli bombings. A student has anonymously told Insider Hayed that she wanted to use the space after being hit with a tear gas canister and having rifles pointed at her. And Palestine Legal files Title VI complaint against George Washington University for years-long hostile anti-Palestinian environment. Yesterday, Palestine Legal filed a federal civil rights complaint with the Department of Education's OCR demanding an immediate investigation into the years-long hostile environment of anti-Palestinian racism that continues unabated at George Washington University. The complaint alleges how, for years, Palestinian students and students perceived to be Palestinian have been denied access to mental health services, falsely accused of committing crimes, disproportionately investigated by campus police, put through months-long disciplinary processes for infractions that non-Palestinian students admitted to, and subjected to racist anti-Palestinian comments in class. Palestine Legal is representing 3 GW students who have each been the target of anti-Palestinian discrimination and harassment by fellow students, Professors GW Hillel and or GW administrators. The complaint explains how GW canceled a virtual processing space, and it also describes how GW Professor Laura Sheehan organized an optional brown bag lunch featuring a Hebrew University professor who is a Palestinian citizen of Israel. Anti-Palestinian students took over her class the following Monday, making numerous anti-Palestinian statements. And there's simply no justification for GW's racist, bigoted treatment of Palestinians, said Razika Sinai. Palestinians' legal complaint asks OCR to bring GW in compliance with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 by taking several remedial measures, including ensuring that the Palestinian students are able to access services on an equal basis as other students, and ending discriminatory investigations of Palestinians and allies who advocate for Palestinian rights, apologizing to the Palestinian students and community members that were harmed, recognizing that opposition to the political ideology of Zionism is anti-racist and integral to support Palestinian equality, and refusing to adopt, enforce, or rely on the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition or its contemporary examples to identify or combat anti-Semitism. The guiding examples attached to the IHRA definition falsely conflate political criticism of Israel's support for Palestine rights with anti-Semitism, placing anyone charged with implementing the definition in the position of engaging in anti-Palestinian bias, writes Palestine Legal's complaint to OCR. Application of the IHRA definition would drive GW administrators into a morass of national origin-based distinctions in violation of Title VI. The discrimination, harassment, stereotyping, disparate treatment, and racial profiling described above were not isolated incidents, but are the product of both deep-rooted dehumanizing bigotry against Palestinians and decades-long systematic efforts by anti-Palestinian groups and their allies to suppress speech supporting Palestinians' rights on college campuses. Since 2014, Palestine Legals responded to over 2,000 incidents of suppression of Palestine activity or advocacy, many involving harassment and censorship attempts by university administrations and anti-Palestinian orgs aimed at intimidating Palestinians and their allies into silence and inaction. And watch this space. Remember, your engagement through a like, a share, subscribe will propel us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before. Gallant Smotrich reached compromise on running the West Bank. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant and Adjunct Minister in the Defense Ministry Bezalel Smotrich on Thursday signed an agreement in keeping with the coalition agreement between Likud and religious Zionism regulating the division of powers between them with regard to managing the liberated territories of the West Bank. And this term liberated is in a matter of opinion. According to the agreement, most of the powers of the civil administration and the West Bank will be transferred to Smotrich, including the Central Supervision Unit responsible for enforcing construction laws in the territories. However, Gallant will have the authority to exercise enforcement against illegal construction defined as a fresh incursion, and demolishing it continues security urgency. Still, Smotrich must be informed ahead of such action. Religious Zionism sent out a press release celebrating 14 issues that have become Smotrich's domain as of Thursday. The civil powers in the West Bank are transferred to Smotrich and will be handled by a deputy chief of the civil administration who will be a civilian. All civilian administration staff officers will be civilians and serve under the deputy chief. The government will issue an ordinance to that effect. The civilian staffers will be fully subordinated to the civilian administration deputy chief. The appointment of civilian staff officers will be the responsibility of Minister Smotrich. Planning and construction in the West Bank, convening of the Supreme Council or the Supreme Planning Council, is the responsibility of Minister Smotrich. The Illegal Construction Supervision and Enforcement Unit is the responsibility of Minister Smotrich. As part of the struggle for open spaces, Smotrich will have the responsibility to initiate new development of nature reserves in the West Bank. In matters of real estate, Minister Smotrich will have full responsibility, including approval of transactions, blue line confirmation, verify that these are state lands, survey processes, and registration of state lands. Transportation planning and the implementation of road plans are the responsibility of Smotrich. Development of additional civil infrastructures, such as water, energy, and environmental quality, is the responsibility of Smotrich. That includes treatment of environmental hazards such as garbage incinerators. The activity of the civil administration concerning settlement regulation is the responsibility of Smotrich. Implementing the equal citizenship reform to optimize services for the residents of the West Bank is the responsibility of Smotrich. Civil legislation within the Green Line will be equated with the laws of the civil administration. In security and other exceptional events, the commander of the IOF Central Command will be allowed to activate its supervision unit while notifying Smotrich. In the event of a dispute, the arbitration will be done by the Prime Minister. Smotrich plans to appoint Yehuda Eliyahu to the position of Deputy Chief of the Civil Administration. Eliyahu was the former CEO of the Benjamin Regional Council. Also, if I'm not mistaken, was the owner of the olive grove that was a part of the controversy about a week ago, which is probably not happenstance. And here's KDL610.com. Israel pro-settler minister formally gains West Bank powers. A far-right Israeli cabinet minister formally gained possibilities over Jewish settlements in the occupied West Bank on Thursday that he said included bringing their legal status closer to that of the communities of Israel. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich wields a supervisory role for settlers in the Defense Ministry as part of his coalition deal with the Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, prompting increased U.S. focus on Israel's West Bank policies. A 14-point statement issued by Smotrich after he agreed on division of roles with Defense Minister Yoav Gallant included the assertion that legislation on all settlement civilian matters will be brought into line with the Israeli law. Asked to elaborate on a Smotrich spokesperson said, equal application of relevant laws on labor, the environment, etc., that are legislated in Lesser Israel. Lesser Israel is a term used by ultranationalists like Smotrich and himself a settler who seek annexation of the West Bank, a biblical and strategic area captured in the '67 war. All settlement is illegal, and any attempt by Israel to legalize or annex these settlements is rejected and is a violation of international resolutions, said Nabil Abu Rudaina, spokesperson for Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. The U.S. has reiterated its decades-old calls for a two-state solution between Israel and the Palestinians and called for a restraint after a surge in violence in the West Bank, which the Palestinians want as the core of a future state. Washington has also urged Israel not to expand settlements which most world powers deem illegal. Smotrich said he would now also have total responsibility over zoning surveys and sales of West Bank lands for settlers who number around 500,000 among 3.1 million Palestinians. Confirming the Smotrich agreement, Netanyahu said it was pursuant to the coalition deals. Netanyahu said in 2019 that he would annex West Bank settlements, alarming the West and prompting the UAE and Bahrain to forge ties with Israel a year later in exchange for the Prime Minister shelving the territorial plan. The platform of Smotrich's religious Zionism party calls for advancing West Bank settlement in the face of a complex U.S. administration by focusing dialogue on the extent of sovereignty Israel will assert and the scale of construction and retroactive authorization of unsanctioned settler outposts. If formal annexation is not possible due to U.S. opposition, it adds de facto assertion of sovereignty should be pursued. And from Barak Times, Smotrich handed sweeping powers over West Bank control over settlement planning. Religious Zionism leader and finance minister Bezalel Smotrich has been given broad authority over civil issues in the West Bank, allowing him to deepen Israel's presence in the West Bank, increase settlement construction, and thwart Palestinian development. The authorities being transferred to Smotrich after an extended internal coalition battle over the issue include enforcement powers over illegal construction, authority over planning, and construction for settlements and land allocation matters. The agreement between Smotrich and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant gives the ultranationalist leader sweeping powers over the territory and allows him to pursue his goal of thwarting Palestinian aspirations for a state in the West Bank, allowing the Israeli population to settle there increases significantly. The agreement was condemned by left-wing anti-settlement organizations including Yeshden, the Federation for Civil Rights in Israel, and breaking the silence which said it amounted to illegal de jure annexation. Of the West Bank. Smotrich himself celebrated the agreement as a holiday for the inhabitants of Judea and Samaria, using the biblical name of the West Bank, while the Yeshua Council, which represents the settlement, said the deal was important news for the settlement enterprise. Get the Times of Israel and watch this space. Remember, your engagement through a like, share, and or subscribe will propel us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before.
Today's unemployment figures show the economy is moving in the right direction. The drop in unemployment is one more sign that the economy is strengthening.
Muckrake's holding journalists accountable. This is The Hill with Robbie Suave, Brianna Joy Gray, interviewing Seymour Hersh.
To you that made you confident in what that person was telling you was accurate?
Oh, if I did, I'd just be out of business, you know, and I've been doing this for a long time with unnamed sources. It all depends on when you do it, when you don't do it. When I was at the New York Times, some of the great stories, many of the stories that were very important, or at least generated a lot of news. In one case, the congressional hearings, the church hearings into the CIA, I had no name sources. But that time, you know, that was then and this is now. So now there's a lot of criticism, and I understand that. I can't talk about my source other than if you read the story carefully, as I'm sure you did. The person that's talking to me, if you're trying to figure out who he is, he or she is never in a meeting. They're just describing what they know. And that's not inadvertent. That's just the way you protect people. And because a lot of people could know things. It wasn't all CIA. It was a joint group that was set up at the direction of Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor. And in a nutshell, I'll just tell you what happened. It's the fall of 2021. The Russians are already, the Putin's, but let's just stick with Putin. Putin is already lining up his troops in Belarus, and it's clear that he's probably going to go. And there's a meeting convened. Jake convenes a meeting. I would assume at the request of the president, Joe Biden, and he brings in a bunch of high-level people from the community. You know, the NSA, CIA, State Department, Joint Chiefs of Staff, what you will, Treasury Department. They supply the money. And they meet in a very secure room in the executive office building. Everybody in Washington knows what that is. It's on the compound right next to the White House itself, where most of the offices are. And the issue is, they started in December of 2021. And the question they have, and this is a word of art, is this is language that is known inside the community. Whether what we want to produce, this group, are actions and recommendations that are reversible or irreversible. If they're reversible, we're talking about sanctions, etc. If they're irreversible, you're talking about kinetic stuff. And eventually, over the next couple of weeks, it emerged that the issue was, of course, the decision was going to be something kinetic. And it eventually, I'm talking about by January, there was a fix on the pipelines could be it. We could hit the pipelines. The worry was always, as most people don't know, Nord Stream 1, there are two pipelines that go supply gas, really a very low price and a huge amount of gas to industrial Germany. The first pipeline began in 2011. It was called Nord Stream 1. And historically, going back to the Kennedy years, and certainly in the Bush-Cheney years, and certainly in this government, and when Joe Biden was vice president, he chaired a group on this. The worry we always had about Russia, always with its great resources of natural gas, they have they just have tons of it, gas and oil, and the worry was that Russia was weaponizing this gas. It was using it to get leverage in Western Europe and Germany, and that was always something that was problematical for us. We wanted to keep Russia from having energy power. And so the same thing happened in this White House. In the meeting, the idea was, what do you do with it? And so one of the options the group came up with, they said, we can blow them. I don't know how far they were, but this was obviously by mid-January of 2022. And by this time, the Russians have as many as 100,000 troops coming. If they're not there then, they're there within a few weeks. They're going. And we know it. And to the amazement of the group that was had been assembled, and I assure you that the president and others didn't have hands-on feeling about it. You don't do it that way. They're always isolated. They had began their. They said it can be done, and to their amazement, Victoria Nuland, the Undersecretary of State, in last January, Again, when Russia hasn't come, she at a news conference, she said, I assure you, if the Russians come, Nord Stream 2 will not exist. It's a brand new, it was the second pipe. Nord Stream 2 was the second gas pipe that was finished, built, it took 10 years, billions of dollars. It was ready to go by late 2021, and the Germans sanctioned it. They cut it down. It was filled with gas, but the Germans, they didn't pump because the German government, obviously under pressure from us, froze it. So it's just sitting there full of gas on 750 miles, one pipeline, they both were 750 miles or so, all the way from a corner of Russia near Leningrad, St. Petersburg, all the way down to the tip of a city in Western, I think, Germany. I get my map mixed up all the time. Anyway, it just was, for the Germans, it was manna. There was so much gas even on Nord Stream 1 that the German companies that had an interest, Nord Stream was controlled by Russian oligarchs, Gazprom. They owned 51% of it, which means that a lot of the money was kicked back into the Russian treasury. Of course it was, billions every year. But 49% of the pipeline was owned by 4 Western companies, and they all had stock. And those Western companies, there was enough gas for them to sell it to other people dealing in home gas heating, et cetera. Downstream, they call it. It was that much. It was a bonanza. And the second pipeline was ready to go, and that would have been made the Russian ability in the eyes of the White House, and not only this White House, but other White Houses all along, weaponization of the gas. So she then, for reasons unknown, at a news conference said, if Russia if Russia attacks Nord Stream 2 by one way or another, that's very close to the exact language, will not go.
Mr.
And
Hersh,
then a couple weeks later,
what you're describing, I think, is the circumstances that show that the incentives here point really against Russia. And of course, the independent investigations that have already taken place have found no, evidence that Russia was at all involved. And in fact, as you've described, there's a conflict of interest that you've described between Germany and Western Europe, who could be the beneficiaries of cheap Russian oil, and the United States, who has these broader security concerns in terms of its own proxy war with Russia. So I want to get back to, if we can, this issue of the people who are criticizing you on the basis of the source. And I wondered if you could give us any more insight into what you, not any obviously facts about who the source is or any identifying information, but what made you feel confident about the source's firsthand knowledge and the accuracy of the knowledge that the source presented to you. Obviously, there's a great deal of kind of factual detail about how strategically the plan was carried out. But in terms of the source confirming that the source was who they represented, that they were in a position where they would have had firsthand knowledge of the events that they described to you, can you tell us anything about what assured you that the source was accurately representing their firsthand knowledge?
I've been in this business with sources like this for 50 years. When I first did My, there was, overwhelmingly disapproval of what I wrote, and most of the stories I wrote that were controversial has always been attacked on the it's easy to get rid of something on the basis of anonymity, and so you have to understand there's no alternatives. Either the people I've known inside have one thing in common, whether military or civilian, and that is they really understand that they've taken their oath of office not to their boss, not to the general or admiral, and not to the president, but to the Constitution. And those are people that, when they get troubled by things that are going on, have talked to me, and this been going on. I've done this for 50 years. So I'm not interested in committing suicide, and I certainly knew. You're getting me. I don't even want to talk about what I know. I wrote the story, and I'll give you a hypothetical if you want. I'll give you a question to ask.
Sure.
Next time somebody at the White House briefing who doesn't want to be called on again for the next 2 months, why don't they ask the president, hey, or the White House, whatever, the press spokesman, whoever it is there, why don't they ask him, say, you know what, this happened in September the 26th last year, and nobody knew what did happen, but 4 days later, Jake Sullivan gave a briefing, and he was asked about it. And he said, well, he read, somebody asked if they thought Russia did it, and he said the usual things. Nobody likes Russia in that White House, and certainly in that CIA, as far as I can tell from the spokesman. And what he said is, well, there's 2 countries are looking at it, Sweden and Norway, and we'll see what happens with their investigation. It's not Sweden and Norway, Sweden and Denmark. The Norwegians, who were very involved with us, have said nothing. And so a month later, sure enough, the Swedes and the Danes issued a report saying that after they studied it, they concluded that indeed something had happened under the water. There had been an explosion. That was the extent of their investigation. So what the White House has, what the president has, if he really wants to know, he's got something called the Office of National Intelligence, which is the highest level office, oversees all of the intelligence in the United States government. And they have an office of, the ONI, they have an incredibly good, competent head of intelligence there. He could have, what the phrase they use inside is tasked those people to do a study. If he chose also to really dig, he could have asked the CIA, which has a directorate of intelligence that does terrific work, I will tell you, very solid stuff. He could have asked the CIA to do a study. And there's also a secret, another third intelligence group that nobody talks much about. When we have a covert operation, an agent that's an operation like this that's undercover, they have their own intelligence. And we're talking about really old source. If you have people overseas doing stuff that are tricky, you want to really protect them. And so why don't you ask if they ever ask the community for a study? Because I'll tell you what the answer is. They never did. And so why don't you think they did? Well,
and Mr. Hersh, how would you respond to, there's been some reporting I've seen that the ships you said that were used, the Norwegian ships, there's some conflicting GPS data suggesting that they were not actually in the area. How would you respond to that part of the criticism?
It's called, it's OSINT, it's open source intelligence, which is a big part of the community. They started that 40 years ago. In other words, they would put out a report, the CIA, this is after World War II when they were first going, and discovered that a lot of what they reported was in the open sources. And so if you're doing a covert operation and you're talking about people that, open source relies on signals. It doesn't have photographs of the ships there. They rely on signals. And they also rely on airplanes that, every airplane has a transponder. And which is sort of an IDF. It lets everybody know where they are at all times. Well, if you read the paper carefully, when the president went to Kiev, when his plane was flying, I think, into Poland, guess what they did? It was in the newspaper. They turned off their transponder. And so I will tell you the trouble with open source intelligence. I've said this to a few people, including one of the guys writing it. But when you're really into computer analysis. The first thing you do in an operation like that is you use open source as a cover, helps you. You invent boats that aren't there. You have airplanes that turned off transponder, which means you can't be seen. It's really as simple as that. I'm being also attacked. They're claiming that somebody claimed that the boat, the class of the boat wasn't there, but we can, the guys who know what they're doing, they can turn everything topsy-turvy. They can create boats, signals of boats. So that's what you do before a mission like that. That's the answer to it. It's really very simple. If those people had asked anybody in the community, they would have told you the first thing you do is manipulate the ongoing intelligence. In fact, what they had up there was the same plane that the president had when he was in Kiev. It's called a River Joint. It's basically a national security agency Air Force wing. It's a old 707 that flies on the border of Russia, collecting radar signals. They had, the president had, what is in the paper, they had a River Joint surveillance plane from the, as I said, there in case he has to get a signal out, an emergency. And there's a direct line. They had that up during this mission in case the guys, the divers or the crew of the ship or something happened, they could communicate. I don't want to break the hearts of OSINT people because a lot of it is very useful, particularly mostly in tracking airplane crashes and stuff like that. But when it comes to covert intelligence operators, they're actually part of the cover.
Well, National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby, as I'm sure you're aware, has repeatedly denied the United States was involved in the explosions that damaged these pipelines. He told Fox News Sunday, quote, "It's a completely false story. There is no truth to it, not a shred of it. It is not true. The United States and no proxies of the United States had anything to do with that." Can you comment directly on that statement? Your friend, he describes himself as your friend Ray McGovern, recently gave remarks at the UN Security Council and basically said these kind of CIA PR statements aren't to be trusted. What's your response?
Well, you have to identify Ray a little better. He was in the CIA for many years, and he was probably the key guy when we were doing a lot of talks with the Russians on treaties. He spent 27 years in the CIA as an intelligence officer and got to be at a level that he was sort of the go-to guy when we were negotiating various ABM treaties with the Soviet Union. So he does know a little more than that. John Kirby's a nice guy. I used to work, John was in the Pentagon. When I was at the New Yorker after 9/11, I wrote a lot of stories that were heatedly denied by the White House when I was working for the New Yorker. This was in the days of Cheney and Bush. And I always liked John. He's a very good guy. And I did talk to him about this story long before I wrote it, let him know what I was doing. And he told, it was off the record, so it doesn't matter. But he didn't say anything other than what he said publicly, but there was other stuff he talked about. And he'll be the first, if you asked him, if there were an operation like this, would the spokesman for the joint JC, the spokesman wouldn't know. Why would you tell him? Why would you tell the spokesman anything? Why would, even internally, would you talk about it?
So you think he genuinely does not know that he's not lying there? He doesn't know.
No, he's not a liar. He's not. He's asked and he's told, no, nothing happened. I don't know if he's asked or not. I'm sure he has, but why would he be told? Why would? Right. I think I said very early, the way they run this operation, the people in the field in Norway or wherever they are in the United States are isolated. The last thing you want to do with something like this is, telling the principals. Can I give you a reason why? In January, they told the principals that they could do something, and within 3 weeks, both Victoria Nuland blabbed about it and said, we'll get it one way or the other. And the president himself said at a briefing on February the 7th, we can take it out, and if they go, we will take it out. I don't know why the press forgets that language, but it horrified the people who were just beginning to get organized on it, because it just was, to them, it's the most secret thing in the world. And the Undersecretary of State and the President of the United States, the word used to me was blabbing about it.
You mentioned just a minute ago that you have this long history of writing for outlets like the New Yorker. Did you approach any of the kind of mainstream type organizations or media outlets you've worked with in the past with this story and try to get it published there? Did they reject it, or were you just going to do this on your own for Substack? Can you tell us anything about the editorial process?
Sure. I don't think I could have got the My Lai story published now. Things have changed a lot because of Trump. As you know, I'm not telling anybody that knows. There's Fox News and the New York Post and other papers like that. And then there's the Washington Post and the New York Times. Actually, neither one of those papers mentioned my story. It's been out for a couple of weeks. I'm telling you, I'm getting massacred by calls from overseas on it. 350, 400 emails today, half of them from overseas news outlets. It's different there. I think the Washington Post, I'm told, I haven't seen it, had a story today for the first time mentioned what I did in the controversy. There was a Security Council meeting about this yesterday. And the New York Times hasn't mentioned it yet. I see what's going on, the polarization of the press that didn't exist. I joined the Times in '72 because, there was no question about what I could do. It's the halcyon days. It's different now. And no, I never thought of approaching either paper because I didn't think they would publish it, particularly because they want to know the source. And I always told the editors the source, and I got burned once at the New York Times that way. I don't like talking about it because the New York Times is still a good newspaper, a lot of fine reporters. I've always been convinced that 90% of the editors, if they were fired, we'd have a much better news organization. I saw who got promoted as we went along. But no, Substack I'm a friend of Matt Taibbi, who's had a Substack column going, and he was telling me it's much more vibrant and it's much more interesting because I self-publish. I use superb editors. I'm using one of my editors I worked for the London Review of Books, and a very bright guy named Chris Lorenzen is the editor, and he's great. I listen to him, and I use, as far as possible, sometimes I can't always get them, I use fact checkers that used to work at the New Yorker when I was there. And at that time, there was no worry about sources. They knew all my sources.
That's really interesting. That's interesting to know because some people have criticized you on the basis that because you're independent, you haven't had that editorial process, you weren't able to, say, share the source with an editor and have them, double check and confirm and give their own gut check on things. But you're saying that that actually isn't the case, that you're still using the same kind of team that you had at these institutional papers, but they're no longer affiliated, even though you're at Substack.
No, I'll tell you the biggest difference in a way that may be the doom for good reporting on newspapers. When I was at the New Yorker, for example, I had a big run. I did the Abu Ghraib story, and for three weeks in a row, and the magazine would tell me, they were all happy because newsstand sales were going up. Newsstand sales of magazines are just about zip now. But the newsstand sales are going up, circulation is growing. And at the end of the year, since I was working for a company, I was always a freelancer. I never wanted to be on the staff of the New Yorker just because I didn't like it. But I was making, earning a lot of money. But at the end of the year, I got a case of wine. And I guess the people that run the magazine, because of the increase in circulation my stories generated, they might have got a hell of a big bonus. Substack says, I'm self-publishing. I didn't do it for money. It's not about money. But it is interesting to me that in the long run, this kind of a system, the Substack was started in part by a couple of guys from New Zealand. One was a high-tech writer, a journalist on high-tech, and the other one, I guess, was an entrepreneur. I don't know when they started it, 5-6 years ago. But I will tell you, it is the most amazing place. The story I put up from nowhere had over 1 million hits within 20 hours. And I get letters constantly from people saying, what happened to this kind of reporting? There's not much of it. Right now, I assure you, I knew this when I worked at the New York Times. I knew that I was one of the very rare people who actually had people on the inside who were not afraid to talk about things they didn't like. You know what I'm saying? If there's something going wrong. And that's something, I've had 3 or 4 like that in 50 years.
Yeah.
And that's
Before we let you go, can you tell us anything about
what's
coming
let me
next?
go. I'm so happy to hear that.
Well, we've kept you here a long time, and we really appreciate it. Can you preview for us your additional reporting on this subject?
What'd you say?
What's coming next? What are you working on now?
Well, I did a couple more pieces. I just did a piece yesterday. I think lying about the
And this is Breakthrough News with Vijay Prishad. Vijay Prishad. Breakthrough News with Vijay Prishad. If I'm not mistaken.
In that conflict, all of that is up for grabs.
Oh, you're muted.
Muted. We just can't. I mean,
you're 100% muted, but I feel like you had to have said something good.
With you.
I don't believe
this global conflict 1 year on, going into tomorrow's 1 year anniversary.
The anniversary itself is filled with debate about what's going on. It's not like something quite straightforward. Something that was a destruction, an earthquake in Syria and in Turkey and so on. Here, how one even talks about what happened last year in February and when that conflict begins and who are the players in that conflict, all of that is up for grabs. Is this a Russian invasion of Ukraine? Is this a contest between NATO and Russia? Where is China in this? Is this a war? You know, as we speak, the G20 countries are gathering in Bangalore in southern India. And that's one of the issues that they've already dealt with on the first day of the G20 meeting. United States trying to say it's a war. This is for the final communique. You know, on day one, they start to draft the communique. United States saying it's a war. India, which is, the chair of the G20 right now, is pushing back and saying, no, we don't want to use the word war. We're going to call it a crisis. You know, the crisis in Ukraine, the crisis or the challenge. These are the two words they are using, crisis and challenge. In fact, Eugene, you started off by saying conflict in Ukraine. Conflict is somewhere in between war and crisis. Crisis is an extremely generic way of talking about what has happened this year in Ukraine. So it's very hard to even understand how to talk about the 1 year anniversary, because how you talk about what's happening is already got inside it your opinion about what's going on in this war. And there's so much quote unquote information war happening that words seem to matter in this conflict, war, much more than in any other conflict, crisis, war that I've ever followed before in my life.
There's so many different aspects of this war. There's the way that it's revealed how, Europe really doesn't have any sort of independent policies of its own. It's really a subject of the Americans on so many levels. It's also demonstrated that, the U.S. is looking at this as a sort of kind of practice round against China, right? We've heard a lot of U.S. officials talking about how Ukraine they want to use the Ukraine playbook with Taiwan. And then there's also the stakes. That's what I want to ask you about. I want to ask you about the stakes, because the stakes of the war seem to keep growing. The escalation, there's almost no means of diplomacy anymore. You have almost no arms treaties left between the U.S. and Russia at this point. You have this explosive story out from Seymour Hersh a couple weeks ago about how the U.S. covertly blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, attacked the infrastructure of its ally Germany in what can only be considered an act of terrorism. I mean, the sort of going up the escalation ladder hasn't stopped since last year, and it seems like, on all sides, particularly on the NATO side, that there's even more resolve to continue to sacrifice Ukrainians at the altar of weakening Russia. And of course, that leaves us with the whole threat of potential nuclear warfare. So I'm curious if you could talk a bit about the seriousness of the stakes of this war, because I don't feel as though that gets talked about enough, particularly in the mainstream.
Well, it is deeply chilling. I mean, look, I was very interested that the Chinese foreign minister went to Munich at the security conference, and he said, now Ukraine, tomorrow Taiwan. He said, is this the road you're taking? And he and Wang Yi, who's the highest Chinese diplomatic official, were asking questions in Munich, which I found quite interesting. What were they asking? They were asking the United States elites, effectively, perhaps the European elites, how far are you willing to go? Are you going to go all the way on this? Are you going to launch nuclear weapons and so on? What's the game plan here? What's up with you guys? And actually, I would say that that's a really good discussion for people to have. What is the US elite up to here? What do they want? Do they want the dismemberment of Russia, the collapse of the current governing structure? Let me tell you something. My generation in the 1990s, my generation in Russia, people who are now in their 50s and 60s, experienced a regime change already. They saw the catastrophic decline in the living standards and so on. People in my generation who are now in positions of some authority in Russia, they simply don't want to see a repeat of that twice in the lifetimes of people. They just don't want to see that again. Whatever their opinion of Mr. Putin, whatever their opinion of the conflict in Ukraine, they're simply not interested in revisiting the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the same way as during the Arab Spring, people used to ask, why aren't the Algerians rising up? Well, because the Algerians fought a decade-long catastrophic civil war. And I remember being in Algiers, being in Oran, asking people, why isn't there, the kind of copycat phenomena of the Arab Spring? And they said, we are exhausted by this stuff. People tried to come after the what is known in Algeria as the power, and then said, look, it's just not going to happen like this. We're not going to go out on the street and see our young killed again. This sense of civilizational exhaustion is not being taken seriously. In the same way, in China, there's a high level of support of the government for all kinds of reasons, perhaps positive reasons. But one of them is that people have looked carefully at what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed, and they don't want to repeat that in China. So the question to ask of the US elites, what's your game plan? Do you really think you're going to be able to dismember Russia? There's no appetite in Russia for it. You're going to have to impose this with force. What kind of force will you use? Are you going to go nuclear, as it were? And now, Mr. Putin has withdrawn Russia from the New START treaty. That was to have expired in 2026. There's some chatter about how, well, Russia is withdrawing from treaties. Let me remind people, and I think, Rania, you already indicated that United States unilaterally withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002. That was George W. Bush. United States unilaterally withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, the INF Treaty 2019. That was Donald Trump. That wasn't Putin. Putin has merely come in on a third run and said, well, you guys are not interested in discussing a architecture for nuclear, as it were, management. We're out of here. We're gone. New START is finished. I was chilled by the departure from New START because now there are no hotlines anymore. There's no red phone between the two important countries, And I think that's the reason why the Chinese came to Munich, why Wang Yi went to Russia, why they're trying to tell Blinken and Biden and others, listen, guys, you got to grow up here. There are serious matters at stake. And the Chinese have launched a global security initiative this week around those issues. It's not just China. It's India, it's Indonesia, it's Mexico, it's South Africa, range of developing countries extraordinarily worried about all this. I was very interested at Munich to listen to the Prime Minister of Namibia. Her name is Sarah Kungonelwa Amadila. And she said something interesting. She first cautioned that this war was going out of hand. And then she said, this is the Prime Minister of Namibia, the bottom line is that money used to buy weapons would be better used to promote development in Ukraine, in Africa, in Asia, in the European Union itself, where many people are facing hardships. That's the attitude of the majority of people in the world. It's well worth your listeners knowing that you add up the total population of North America, Canada and the United States, leave out Mexico, Canada, the United States and Europe, you'll struggle to reach 1 billion people. There are 7 billion people on the planet. 1 billion people don't constitute the international community. And in that 1 billion people, there's a lot of disagreement with what their governments are doing. So they don't even speak for 1 billion people in a planet of 7 billion. And that's why they're having a great deal of difficulty in the G20. And that's the reason why Emmanuel Macron in Munich said that the West has lost credibility in the global South. Very strong statement from Emmanuel Macron.
I think you raise a good point, and it's one of these questions that I think is very much hanging over geopolitics. Is all of these different sort of Western architectures, the G20. I took Yellen's pushing at the finance ministers meeting around Ukraine to be sort of bullying of India. We saw last year Indonesia was the president of the G20, same thing, constant bullying them to take a particular position, to ban Russia, to invite Zelensky, so on and so forth. Next two presidents of the G20 are Brazil and South Africa, maybe in the reverse order. But I just maybe am wondering your thoughts about some of these changes we're seeing go through them, because obviously the G20 was not set up to be a forum for the global South to have a platform, but to include a handful more countries into the Western club.
Well, look, the G20 was created, Eugene, just to remind us to provide liquidity in the Western financial institutions, because in 2007, China and India were running surpluses, and the Western countries went begging to Indonesia, India, China, and other countries and said, put some of your money into our banking system because our banking system is insolvent. And they, in fact, Sarkozy said, we're going to shut down the G7 and the G20 will be the new executive of the world. Well, they created the G20, they maintained the G7. Now Janet Yellen came in and started pushing people around and saying, hello, listen, got to increase sanctions on Russia. I was very interested in the response from several of the countries. The first interesting response was they basically went to rule. They said, look, this is not the Security Council, Ms. Yellen. This is a body to deal with economic issues. We deal with trade issues, with financial management of the world order. So they basically came to rule. They said, no, wait, you're in the wrong forum. You want to talk about sanctions? Go to the UN Security Council. This is not where we talk about sanctions. This is where we talk about economic growth, where we talk about the fact that the total global debt overhang is $65 trillion. I mean, this is where we deal with that. This is where we deal with declining growth rates. I thought that was a very interesting and studious response to Janet Yellen. It also shows the desperation of the United States, which is using every and any forum to try to browbeat countries of the global south. You know, for instance, the US-Africa summit held in December in Washington, D.C. was a way to get African countries to basically come on side. And guess what? Here's the Namibian Prime Minister in Munich saying, sorry, pals, I'm not with you. The attempt to get countries around the world to send arms to Ukraine, you know, the full court press trying to get Brazil to send arms to Ukraine, and the Brazilians saying, listen, you know, this is not what we buy arms for. It's not to transship them to Ukraine. And by the way, the reason I slipped and said Israel is because the United States had Israel send a lot of the warehoused equipment to Ukraine, the kind of stuff that was rotting in an Israeli warehouse, in order for the West to say, look, we're arming the Ukrainians. I mean, there's got to be a little bit of you got to understand that they're also putting out their used surplus on the Ukrainians and, you know, jetting up their own engines to get new supplies for themselves. This is not all humanitarian. You know, the US is ordering a lot of stuff for itself. Anyway, the point is that the US is desperate, going to every single forum, trying to get people to, you know, arm twist countries to condemn Russia, to bring Ukraine into the fold and so on. These countries are just not going to do it. I mean, look in India, for instance, the big top elites, the Ambanis, the Adanis, and so on, they are buying coal from Russia. They are buying energy. The Indian public sector energy company, ONGC, Oil and Natural Gas Corporation, is buying assets that the Europeans and the Americans are vacating in Russia. The business opportunities with the Russians are also attractive. It's not just this. And also something that I want to put on the table here is there is a growing, and I don't know what kind of adjective to use for this, but there's a growing sentiment among the middle class in countries like India, Indonesia, Mexico, Brazil, and so on, which is quote unquote, but they want to be interests and so on. And in a way, the Yanks are groveling in the early decades of globalization is now finally standing up and saying, hey, listen, you know, if we want to eat something, we're going to eat it. You know, we want to smoke in our houses, we're going to do that. There's a kind of middle class arrival in these countries, which I think is a surprise to the United States.
And watch this space. Remember, your engagement through a like, share, or subscribe will propel us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before.
It is is obvious to the most simple-minded that Lokai is of an inferior breed.
The obvious visual evidence, Commissioner, is that he is of the same breed as yourself.
Are you blind, Commander Spock? Oh, look at me.
I thought you scientists were supposed to keep an open mind.
There's a difference between keeping an open mind and believing something because you want it to be true.
Your friend Spock is a logical man.
I find your arguments strewn with gaping defects in logic.
Most
Maybe.
illogical reaction. We demonstrated our
The whole
superior
notion
weapons.
of
They should have fled.
logic.
You mean they should have respected us?
Of course.
Mr. Spock, respect is a rational process. Did it ever occur to you they might react emotionally? With anger?
Doctor, I'm not responsible for their unpredictability.
You do not think like the others. There are no colors to your patterns of logic. There's only black and white.
Logical, unemotional, completely pragmatic. And we poor, irrational humans whip them in a fair fight. Now you'll find yourself back among us illogical humans again.
Which I find eminently satisfactory, Doctor. For nowhere am I so desperately needed.
Because she feels. I don't. All I know is logic.
Will you try to understand how we feel about our life here? About each other?
The whole notion of logic.
Emotions are alien to me. I'm a scientist.
You're gonna leave here without them? Run off on some wild goose chase halfway across the galaxy just because you found a discrepancy in a hydrogen cloud?
Doctor, I'm chasing the captain, Lieutenant Uhura, and Ensign Chekhov, not some wild aquatic fowl.
Mr. Spock, you have a remarkably logical and analytical mind.
Thank you. I prefer the concrete, the graspable, the provable.
You'd make a splendid computer,
Let's
Mr.
try and unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
Ansar Allah warns foreign invaders over military presence. The Ansar Allah leader accused the U.S. of boycotting any initiative by the Sultanate of Oman to restore nationwide peace and stability to Yemen. During a televised speech on 23 February, the leader of the Yemen's Ansar Allah resistance movement, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, said that the presence of U.S., British, Saudi, and Emirati troops in Yemen are unacceptable and that the resistance has the right to deal with its aggression and occupation of the country. We say to the American, the British, the Saudi, and the Emirati, leave all of our provinces and our territorial waters, he said. Al-Houthi denounced the U.S. for prolonging the world's worst humanitarian crisis in order to make enormous profits from arms deals with Saudi Arabia and its regional allies, which are waging a devastating war in the country, according to Sabah news agency. The U.S. is behind many years in conflicts and the criminal practices that go on in the world so that their arms sales companies can profit. They're behind the confiscation of people's rights to freedom and independence, as in Palestine, he said. The leader of the Ansar Allah resistance movement made the comments as people gathered in the capital city of Sana'a for a ceremony to honor the late Saleh al-Samad, the head of the country's Supreme Political Council, who was killed by a drone strike by the Saudi-led coalition on 23 April 2018. The alliance of aggression has perpetuated or perpetrated absolutely horrendous and horrifying crimes and acts of savagery in Yemen. Under the auspices of the U.S., Israel, and Britain, nothing can justify their crimes. Al-Houthi said in regard to the extent of the brutality unleashed by the Saudi-led coalition, these statements come at a time when the UN and regional countries, particularly Oman, are making continuous efforts to extend a comprehensive ceasefire in the country, which lasted 6 months and officially ended last October. Al-Houthi also insisted that the course of any dialogue or agreement must lead to the withdrawal of occupation forces and the prevention of foreign interference in Yemen's internal affairs. We cannot accept the presence of occupying forces on Yemeni soil as their deployment translates into interference in our domestic affairs. We'll spare no effort to drive occupying American and British forces out of our country, the Ansar Allah leader stressed. Early in January, Abdul Malik al-Houthi said that despite efforts to renew the UN-brokered humanitarian ceasefire, the country remains in a state of war, which is being fueled by the U.S. and its allies. Despite ups and downs over the last few months, it was reported in January that talks had borne some fruit, as Saudi Arabia had reportedly agreed to eventually lift the blockade on Hodeidah port and Sana'a International Airport, as well as pay the salaries of government employees in the territories affiliated with the National Salvation Government, and was stipulated in the initial agreement. Here's some footage from his speech on the 23rd.
على مستوى الاستهداف الاقتصادي فالحكاية كبيرة في ذلك، ومعاناة شعوبنا على المستوى الاقتصادي معاناة كبيرة جدا، ولهم الدور الأساسي في صناعة هذه المعاناة. يقومون بنشر الربا والسعي إلى أن يعتمد كسياسة اقتصادية أساسية في بلداننا، بينما هو في الواقع وسيلة ابتزاز وظلم وأداة لتقييد الاقتصاد للدول الفقيرة والتحكم فيها، وهو بالفعل يحدث نكبة اقتصادية ومضاره كبيرة جدا على شعوبنا. يباشرون الضغوط الاقتصادية على بلداننا ويحاولون أن يحرموا بلداننا من ثرواتها المهمة ومن الاستفادة منها ومن استخراجها بالشكل المطلوب، وبرنامجهم في ذلك واضح، بينما شعوب أمتنا بأمس الحاجة إلى الاستفادة من ثرواتها الوطنية. يعملون أيضا من خلال منظمات ومؤسسات نقدية لشرعنة الحرب الاقتصادية على بلداننا عبر كثير من المؤسسات التي ينشئونها ويفرضون من خلالها سياسات اقتصادية جائرة وظالمة، ينتج عن تلك السياسات غلاء الأسعار، ضرب الخدمات العامة، المصالح العامة، تأثير على المواطنين وعلى أبناء شعوب أمتنا في معيشتهم بشكل مباشر، في وضعهم المعيشي بشكل مباشر، مثلما قصة الصندوق الدولي والبنك الدولي وغيرها من المنظمات الاقتصادية. حرصوا عبر الدولار الذي يطبعونه بدون غطاء من الذهب على التحكم بثروات الشعوب وسرقة خيراتها وضرب عملاتها والتأثير على وضعها الاقتصادي بشكل كبير. وقد خدمتها السعودية ودول الخليج لترسيخ هيمنة الدولار عندما ربطت الدولار بالنفط وجعلت للدولار دوره العالمي واعتماده كعملة دولية، وهذا أضر بالشعوب بشكل كبير. يمارسون الحصار الاقتصادي لمعاقبة أي دولة تخرج عن طاعتهم وهيمنتهم، مثلما فعلوه مع بلدنا العزيز ويفعلونه مع سوريا، مع إيران، مع بلدان أخرى. والحصار جريمة كبيرة جدا، لأنه جريمة عقاب جماعي للشعوب، إضرار بكل الناس، تعقيد للوضع المعيشي للمجتمعات، تجويع للمجتمعات، ولذلك يعتبر من أكبر الجرائم بحق المجتمعات. يعملون على أن تبقى الأسواق العربية والإسلامية بشكل عام مفتوحة للمنتجات الأمريكية والصهيونية التي يجب أن تكون مقاطعة وليس محل ترحيب من قبل الناس. يعملون على إغراق الدول حتى التي تستجيب لهم وتستجيب لسياساتهم بالقروض الربوية واستغلال تلك القروض فيما لا يفيدها ولا يبني اقتصادها، بل يستغلونها من خلال ذلك ويضغطون عليها ويفرضون عليها سياسات اقتصادية تدميرية. يسرقون وينهبون الثروات النفطية والمعدنية إما بطريقة مباشرة مثل ما يفعلونه في بعض بلداننا أو عبر عملائهم، وهذا شيء واضح، وعلى حساب معاناة الشعوب نفسها، وهي تعاني أشد المعاناة. يستولون على أموال بلداننا بمسمى التجميد لأصول الدول التي تتعرض لعقوبات أمريكية، وهذا حصل مع الكثير من البلدان من بينها اليمن. هناك أموال يمنية، عدد كبير من الأموال الموجودة في أمريكا التي تتبع البنك المركزي جمدوها ولم يعيدوها لشعبنا العزيز. هناك مبلغ كبير لأفغانستان 10 مليار دولار قامت أمريكا بأخذه تجميد ومصادرة وأخذ وحرمان الشعب الأفغاني في الوقت الذي هو في أمس الحاجة إليه. جمدوا على كثير من البلدان الإسلامية أموالها التي كانت تودع في بنوكهم، وائتمانهم وإيداع الأموال في بنوكهم هو خطأ فادح. لو كان هناك وعي قرآني لدى بلداننا وشعوب أمتنا لما أودعوا شيئا من الأموال في بنوكهم، في البنوك الأمريكية، مع أنهم يجدون أن هذه الحالة تتكرر، حالة التجميد والمصادرة للأموال، لأبسط سبب. أحيانا يصطنعون هم سببا لتجميد أموال ومصادرة أموال. يعملون على ابتزاز الأمة ماليا من خلال أي مشكلة أو قضية، وفي كثير من القضايا التي يقفونهم خلفها، مثل قصة قضية لوكربي التي ابتزوا ليبيا من خلالها بأموال طائلة، وقضايا مشابهة أخرى. يزرعون عملاءهم الذين يعملون في الدول في المجال الاقتصادي، ويكون لهم مواقع مسؤولية في هياكل الدول في الجوانب التي تعنى بالاقتصاد، في الوزارات والمؤسسات المعنية بالاقتصاد. عملاء لهم يعملون على تخريب الاقتصاد من الداخل من خلال أساليب كثيرة، سياسات، فساد مالي، أشكال كثيرة جدا لضرب الاقتصاد الوطني في أي بلد من بلدان أمتنا. يحرصون على أن تبقى شعوبنا متناحرة وبعيدة عن أفق أي وحدة لا تخدم المصلحة الأمريكية، وهذا هو حال بلدنا على مستوى عام. الوطن العربي الذي سيطر على شعوبه الشقاق والتناحر وسرقة الخيرات والموارد الطبيعية وغيرها. يعملون بشكل مستمر على ضرب العملات المحلية للدول ببلداننا بشكل عام، وهذا حاصل بشكل كبير ومؤثر على شعوبنا، تارة بسبب العقوبات، أخرى بسبب الديون، وتحت عناوين متعددة. وحصلت مآسي عندنا في اليمن، وهناك الآن مأساة في لبنان بسبب ضرب العملة المحلية. في بقية البلدان كل دولة ربما أو معظم الدول عانت بشكل كبير لضرب عملتها المحلية. يعملون على نشر المخدرات والخمور في المجتمعات العربية والإسلامية والترويج لها والتمكين لها لكي تصبح متاحة للمستهلك، وما يترتب على ذلك من إفساد الشباب كشريحة منتجة وضياع للأموال واعتماد على التجارة في المحرمات التي تدمر الأمة وتضر بالأمة ولا تبنيها ولا تنهض بها. وهذا استهداف شامل بهذه الطريقة، استهداف للأمن، استهداف للقيم، استهداف للأخلاق، استهداف للاقتصاد. وقضية انتشار المخدرات والترويج لها أصبحت من المشاكل الخطيرة التي تهدد مجتمعاتنا في عدد من الدول. يعملون على منع الإنتاج الداخلي للبلدان وضرب الإنتاج الزراعي والحيلولة دون تحقيق الاكتفاء الذاتي. وهذا من أكثر ما تعاني منه شعوبنا، أنها تحولت إلى أسواق فقط لاستيراد بضائعهم، ولا تنتج احتياجاتها الضرورية، ولا تسعى لتحقيق الاكتفاء الذاتي حتى في غذائها الضروري. ويعملون على ضرب الإنتاج الزراعي، وهذه من أكبر أشكال الاستهداف لشعوبنا. هذا بعض من العناوين الاستهداف في المجال الاقتصادي. نجد أنهم يستهدفون الناس بكل أشكال الاستهداف وبشكل رهيب. يستهدفون الناس في حياتهم ويستهدفون الناس في معيشتهم، يستهدفون الناس في عقيدتهم، في أمنهم، في كل شؤون حياتهم. استهداف إجرامي بشع وظالم بكل أشكال الظلم. مع ذلك يتحدثون عن حقوق الإنسان وينتقدون أي بلد مستهدف حتى في الإجراءات المشروعة أو الأعمال التي لا بد منها لتعزيز الأمن والاستقرار الداخلي ضمن ضوابط الشرع والقانون. يأتون هم لينتقدون أبسط شيء من ذلك ويتحدثون عن حقوق الإنسان ويقدمون أنفسهم إلى الشعوب حتى في عناوين أعمال وخطط جديدة يشتغلون من خلالها لاختراق الشعوب، يخاطبونها بحقوق الإنسان ويقدمون لها هذا العنوان. إذا جئنا للتعرف على حقوق الإنسان على الطريقة الأمريكية والإسرائيلية والغربية، نجد أن أكبر جرائم القتل للناس في التاريخ المعاصر بوسائل الإبادة الجماعية التي تقتل أكبر عدد ممكن من الناس، ومنها الأسلحة النووية والأسلحة المحرمة دوليا والأسلحة الفتاكة، هي جرائم ارتكبتها أمريكا وإسرائيل والدول الغربية ولا زالت ترتكبها. أكبر جرائم القتل والإبادة للمجتمع البشري، وضحاياهم في التاريخ المعاصر ضحايا جرائمهم، ضحايا عدوانهم وطغيانهم، جرائمهم الوحشية بمئات الملايين من المجتمع البشري في مختلف بلدان وشعوب العالم. أمريكا هي التي استخدمت السلاح النووي في اليابان وقتلت البشر بشكل عام في مدينتين من مدن اليابان، قتلت السكان بشكل عام، كبارا وصغارا، أطفالا وشبابا، نساء ورجالا، سعت لقتل الجميع وإبادتهم بطريقة وحشية. جرائم كبيرة جدا لقتل الناس بإبادة جماعية في عدوانهم على بلداننا، فيما حصل في فلسطين، في العراق، عندنا في اليمن خلال كل السنوات الثمان هذه. جرائم الإبادة الجماعية واستخدام أفتك الأسلحة وأخطر الأسلحة لذلك، لتحقيق ذلك. أكبر جرائم الإبادة بالأوبئة والتجويع والحصار الاقتصادي والوسائل الأخرى هم من يرتكبها، وضحايا هذا النوع من الاستهداف للشعوب بالملايين الذين يموتون بالأوبئة، بالتجويع، بالحصار الاقتصادي. يفتعلون الحروب ويشجعون عليها وكذلك الفتن، وهم وراء الكثير منها ووراء ما يحدث فيها من ممارسات إجرامية بحق المدنيين والأسرى، وهم يسعون لذلك لكي تستفيد شركاتهم التي تبيع السلاح، تحصل على الكثير من الأموال من خلال دماء الناس وإزهاق أرواحهم وتدمير أمن المجتمعات، والهدف مادي من وراء ذلك في كثير من الحالات. هم وراء مصادرة حقوق الشعوب، الحقوق المشروعة في الحرية والاستقلال والعيش بكرامة، كما في فلسطين شعب فلسطين يمتلك هذا الحق في الاستقلال والحرية والعيش بكرامة. من الذي يحاول أن يحرمه من هذا الحق؟ أمريكا وإسرائيل والدول الغربية. يحاربوننا في اليمن في محاولة منهم لحرماننا من هذا الحق، وكذلك بقية شعوب أمتنا. هم من يمارسون الامتهان للكرامة الإنسانية بكل الأشكال، كما في سجونهم، وجرائم الاغتصاب والتعذيب وغير ذلك. ونموذجهم معروف، سجن أبو غريب. ماذا فعلوا في سجن أبو غريب؟ سجن غوانتنامو بقية سجونهم. أبشع ممارسات الانتهاك للكرامة الإنسانية يمارسها الأمريكيون والإسرائيليون والدول الغربية وعملاؤهم الذين يقاتلون في صفهم ويتحالفون معهم، ثم يأتي ليتحدث معك عن حقوق الإنسان. حقوق الإنسان على الطريقة الأمريكية والإسرائيلية هي ما فعلوه في سجن أبو غريب وغوانتنامو وما يرتكبونه من جرائم رهيبة وشنيعة.
And from Press TV, Yemeni government, UN efforts in Yemen aim to divide nation. The UN Special Envoy to Yemen, Hans Grunberg, has been busy this week meeting with Yemeni and UAE officials in the Emirates. The UN Envoy's office posted a tweet stating the latest efforts are aimed at improving Yemenis' living conditions and securing longer-term peace, security, and development. Given the UN's track record in Yemen, it behooves one to raise some questions about what security, peace, and development look like through the political lens of the UN. I visited Mohammed al-Nuami, a member of Yemen's Supreme Political Council, to hear his take on the UN's progress in establishing security, lasting peace, and development in Yemen. Al-Nuami also said the UN and its partners' political ambitions are not limited to Yemen. Abdel Khalik Kobar, a Yemeni judge I spoke with, said cases of war crimes should be filed against members of the United Nations, who he says are actively engaged in covering up the crimes against humanity perpetrated on Yemenis. In his televised speech last week, the leader of the Ansar Allah resistance move, Saeed Abdel Malik al-Houthi, called on the Yemeni people to be prepared for war in case peaceful efforts fail to bring about the Yemeni people's demands. The UN claims to be engaged in peaceful efforts. To bring an end to the conflict in Yemen. However, according to Ansar Allah officials, the world body has been engaged in efforts to divide the countries in the region. Officials we spoke with believe this is a part of a greater plan which aims to prevent the Muslim world from uniting against Western imperialism. I'm going to open up a channel here. We'll see you tomorrow. Remember that your engagement through a like, a share, subscribe will propel us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before.
Beam me up, Mr. Spark. Beam me up. Lock on transporters. Beam us up. Beam us up. Quickly. Beam us up home. Beam us up.
Prepare to beam us up, Mr. Scott. Beam us up, Mr. Scott.
Prepare to beam us up. Mr. Scott, prepare to beam us up. Have Scotty beam us up. Beam us up. Beam us up. Scotty, beam us up fast. Stand by to beam us up. Scotty, beam me up.
Beam me up.
Beam us up now!
Stand by to beam us up.
No need to beam me up, sir. The situation is under control.